Disclaimer: the views expressed on this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek are solely the opinions of the host and the guest. The content of the conversation is not reflective of the institutions or establishments mentioned therein. Take all these opinions with a pinch of salt and a dash of lime if needed. Namaskara, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching or listening, and welcome to this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek. Today, I am just going to briefly talk about a rather opposing perspective to me starting this journey of podcasting, in that, can we actually relate to people? Other than that, I'm also going to be talking about some exciting stuff that's coming up in the near future, which I've briefly referenced a few months back. So, those are the things that are going to be in store on this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek. All right. So, going back to that opposing perspective that I mentioned in the introduction, can we actually relate to people? This question sort of sprung up in my mind while I was watching a video created by these stand-up comedians Abba and Preach. Um, they make a lot of interesting sort of videos where they discuss a lot between themselves. Um, they share their opinions on some stuff that's quite wide ranging, so to speak. I'll make sure to link their channel below if that's something that you want to check out. But it was one of their videos where they said something along the lines of, people are not necessarily always seeking to relate, but they're seeking a different perspective, a different way of viewing things, and our sort of story or our perspective of the way we view certain things. Now, that was totally a paraphrase statement there. I can't necessarily remember the specifics of what they said, but that was the gist of it to my knowledge. Um, and that made me think. That made me think about like the reason behind me starting all of this in some sense. And maybe I was just overthinking to some extent, but it did make me want to reflect on the idea of relating to people, because that is pretty much the foundation of this venture, so to speak. When the epiphany hit me back in 2020, around the time of June or July, it was that realization that we all as humans are seeking the same things. We're all seeking to survive. We're all seeking to be happy. We're all seeking to have a roof above our head, and etc. Now, in that foundational sense, yes, I do believe that we can still relate to people. However, I guess the question that I have is more probably from the perspective of the macro. And or I don't know if that's the right word to use there, but it's from the perspective of everyday life, so to speak. Now, I can't relate to the struggles that somebody is having on the other side of the world. My struggles are different from their struggles, and it'll be a lot harder for me to understand why they're going through those struggles. It's not impossible, and it's definitely possible for us to empathize with the situations that they're going through, or empathize with those people specifically. Um, but it's a lot harder to maybe even empathize in some sense, when we don't necessarily understand the intricacies of some of these things. Um, it is also hard to sort of imagine some of the difficulties that people tend to go through. Now, in no way am I trying to diminish the difficulties that people tend to have in all parts of the world. Everybody has their own struggles, and their struggles can seem like the entire world falling on top of them in some sense. And I'm not diminishing that fact. That is totally possible, because at the end of the day, we're all playing a single player game where we're trying to make things work for our own benefit, so to speak. But there is a level of understanding also to realize that in a lot of these situations, we've had no control over where we were born. So, in some sense, well, if you want to put aside the argument that is based on spirituality and religion, putting that argument aside, because personally I'm a believer in rebirth and stuff. Uh, I guess stuff is one way of truncating that whole point, but I'll leave it at that for now, because that's not what I'm trying to get at on this episode. But it's something that we don't have control over. We don't have control over as a physical being as to what part of the world we are born in. And that in itself can build us all a foundation that we don't sometimes realize that we have. Because, I mean, there's a lot of things that we take for granted as human beings. And some of that, in my personal opinion, comes from that lack of knowing that just being born in a certain country or being born within a certain family has given us that foundation that is allowing us to propel ourselves wherever we want to go. So from that sense, it is going to be a little hard to understand why some people can't come out of the struggles that they have in different parts of the world. There's sometimes a lot of these throwaway lines that are sort of just said out loud, where why can't he just work hard and figure it out, or um why can't they just move to a different country in X, Y, and Z? Like I briefly mentioned, we tend to forget that we have certain liberties and luxuries that some other people don't. And that is something that we can't relate to as one another. We can relate to having struggles in life, totally. But I guess in some sense, we probably can't relate to each other about the specific struggles that we're having. I don't know, I'm probably making this sound quite convoluted, and I'm just spitting off the top of the dome. I didn't necessarily want to prepare anything for this, because I wanted it to just flow naturally and sort of let my thoughts create um, a topic of conversation for this episode. So, yeah, like from that sense, it's definitely a lot harder to relate to someone, because it's just hard to understand. It's just hard to understand some things that some people might be going through. Now, you can see it, you can help in some sense, you can observe it for what it is. But by understand, what I mean is that we're not going to be able to understand what's going on between that person's ears, the thoughts that are flowing in their head, how they're trying to tackle certain things. And I think there is a level of empathy there too, to where we need to understand that. I'm using the word understand a lot, but we need to realize that we won't always necessarily know the reason behind one choosing to do a certain thing, but that is totally fine. That is totally fine. Because as human beings, we don't know much. While we do know certain things, as that quote goes, the more you learn, the more you realize that you don't know much. I butchered that quote, but anyway, that's not the point of this. Excuse me. It is fascinating to think about this sort of, I guess, duality in my head. Like, at least I found it interesting when I sort of, because in some sense, I like asking myself questions, um, possibly trying to reflect on certain things. And sometimes I do end up overthinking, and that is something that I need to work on personally. And this was just one of those questions that I had when I heard Abba and Preach talk about it. There is a lot to understand when people share their different perspectives. Because through conversation, there's a lot we can learn. There's a lot we can understand better. And I know I've probably used the word understand 100 times, but I do think that it's important in this scope of the conversation. Now I just have a flood of thoughts where I'm trying to separate the ones I want to sort of bring out, um, that are important for this conversation and that pertain to this conversation topic. And this is another question that I'm probably asking myself. Am I trying to just look at the different, like, or the opposite side of something that I believe in? And is there something that is possibly flawed with the way that I look at the world? And is there something that I can maybe learn from this opposite side and adapt into my worldview? So, with that being said, like, that sort of answers, in some sense, the reason why I am pondering on this aloud, pondering on whether or not we can actually relate to one another, and if all of this is just, I guess, meaningless is too strong of a word. That doesn't really apply. By all of this, I mean this venture in itself. But it's not meaningless. It's definitely not. But is it promoting what the title suggests? And again, there's more than one side for this argument. Because, from one sense, I can make the point that I made earlier about the foundational ways that we can relate to one another as human beings. We can relate to wanting to seek a level of happiness, like I mentioned earlier, wanting to be better in some sense, be it financially, spiritually. We all want to reach a different level in different scopes of life, of course, but we all do want to elevate ourselves to some extent. And the opposing side, excuse me, I don't know why my pronunciation of the word opposing switched a couple of times over there, but from the opposing side, I think one could say that relatability is not something that can necessarily be understood on a surface level. We live in a world today where a lot of things are surface level. So, again, this is just the opposing argument that's coming from me. So, there's probably a better opposing argument that someone else has out there. And if you are listening to this and if you do have an opposing argument to the foundation of what random relatability is, which I mean, I've talked about a lot in previous episodes, so I don't want to sort of beat a dead horse there. But yeah, in the opposing argument that is coming out of my head, we live in a world where a lot of things are, or almost all things are surface level. So from a surface level, it's going to be very hard to relate to one another. And at this point, I probably will repeat some of the things that I've already said. But yeah, like it's a lot harder to relate to the experiences that somebody's having someplace else. So that is sort of the opposing argument that can be made, which is why I guess the word random relatability is even more, I don't know if I'm using this word right, but poignant? Maybe, maybe not. But hey ho, English is not my first language, even though I grew up speaking English for most of my life. I apologize if I didn't use that word correctly, but what I'm trying to say is the word random, like, or the phrase random relatability, which is the name of this channel, and the sort of foundation of this podcast of Perspective Platoon that I've started, or this podcast called Perspective Platoon that I've started about a year and 3 months back or 4 months back. It's in those deeper levels that we can relate to one another. Or at least that's how I see it, I should say, because my subjectivity is not the perspective of the world. My subjectivity is just my perspective. Um, and it might add to an interesting conversation, but then again, that's not necessarily the way the world has to view my channel, if you want to call it, or if you want to put it that way, to sort of bring it back to that. For me, random relatability was about seeking relatability from a deeper sense. Because irrespective of what side of the aisle you fall on, be it Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, whatever the fuck there is out there, and all the different titles that people can find for themselves to put themselves on different ends of an argument, so to speak. At the end of the day, there is a lot of common ground that can be found, even on either sides of the spectrum. In terms of the things that we want as people, which I've already touched on, so I'm not going to beat that drum again. So for me, that's what random relatability means. And a platoon of perspectives is just that. It's multiple different perspectives being shared through this medium of podcasting. And it's a simpleton like me whose perspective you get to hear through the podcast. And I'm really lucky in the sense that a lot of people have said yes to coming on and sharing their perspectives with me and with those of you who are watching and listening. So that's what it all entirely means at the end of the day for me in terms of what this channel is and what the podcast is meant to do in terms of the ecosystem of the internet. It's just here to share a sense of common ground that we can find even if we have opposing perspectives. Now, in the future, I do hope to sort of challenge myself with having conversations with people who might have very different perspectives than I do. And I do want to challenge myself as things go on. So if you do have any challenging opinions that you'd like to bring forth, that you'd like to talk about, I'd be more than happy to. So please feel free to reach out to me through Instagram or to Twitter, and let me know. And I'd be more than happy to indulge in a conversation about that. So yeah, I'm gonna bring an end to all of this fluff, just by saying, just by reiterating the question, sort of answering the question that opened this episode, and sort of answering that. Can we relate to people? On a surface level, probably not as easily, but on a deeper foundational level of who we are as human beings, totally. That's at least how I see it. So there we go. That is me rumbling and rambling and uh, spitting off of the top of my dome with regards to that conflicting thought that I've had for a couple of weeks now. But transitioning into the other thing that I mentioned at the introduction, or in the introduction rather, which is some exciting stuff that's coming up in terms of random relatability and content creation and whatnot. I am going to use this sort of paraphrase statement that I made off of what Abba and Preach said, in that people are interested in different perspectives in to some level of understanding. It might not be easy to relate to everybody, but again, this is me just paraphrasing what they said. If I can find that video, I'm gonna make sure to link it in the description, like that video specifically, because I've binge watched like 10 of their videos all at once, like many days on. So at this point, it's probably in a bunch of the 100 or 200 videos that I've watched. So I can't remember where that's from, where they may, or which video they made that statement in. But anyway, going back to where I started off this bit, if you will, I want to add to that different perspective in a different way, um, through having created this channel. And in some sense, all of these solo podcasts that I have been doing have sort of helped me put certain things into perspective of how I could do a solo thing, maybe um, do like talking head videos and such and such. So, with all that being said, what I'm trying to get at is this: I'm going to be starting a second channel called Random Relatability Bite Sized, which basically means smaller chunks of random relatability. I don't know why I felt the need to explain that, but hey ho, I already did, so there we are. Um, that channel for now is mainly going to be clips of all the podcast episodes that have released so far and that will release in the future. I understand that it's not everybody's cup of tea to sit down and watch an episode for like an hour and a half or listen to an episode for an hour and a half. So I'm going to be cutting down clips of all these episodes eventually. And I'll upload them every day, probably 2 to 3 clips a day, every day of the week. So you can go and check these out. Like, you'll probably now, if you're new around here, you'll get to see some of the first podcast that I made. And you'll also get to see some of the newer stuff, but in a more shorter version, So there is that. That's the main sort of medium. Or I should frame it this way: Random Relatability Bite Sized, the second YouTube channel, is going to be a medium for all of these podcast clips. Secondly, I will be releasing a talking head video, like a solo video of me just talking about different topics. The goal is to do that every Wednesday. So basically, if there is 3 podcast clips that release every day of the week, on Wednesdays, I will release 2 podcast clips and then I will release this video of a solo video of me just blabbering as I have been on these solo episodes. But they're probably not going to be as long. They're probably going to be. I've contemplated, I have a lot of ideas, but to boil it down, it's not going to be as long as 30 minutes. It's definitely going to be a lot shorter than that. And I'm going to be releasing those every Wednesday, sort of emulating what I've done so far with this channel for the past month and a half to compensate for the episodes I didn't record when I took a break. So that gave me the opportunity to sort of understand how I could do this myself and sort of get a feel for it. So I guess in some sense it's all worked out very nicely. So there you have it. That's the exciting announcement. Woohoo! I'm going to be starting a second channel, mainly for clips. But then every Wednesday, I'll also be releasing a solo video where I'll be talking about certain topics. I will make sure to release like a smaller explainer video / trailer, if you want to call it that, on Instagram as a substitute for Bish Bash Bosh for this episode. So if you've watched this, be on the lookout for that as well on the Instagram page. Yeah, other than that, I just want to say thank you once again. Thank you for being a part of all of this for the past year and coming on 5 months now. Sure, in some sense, a part of me is not necessarily happy about the growth that the channel has had, but then I came in knowing that that would happen. I came in understanding that it is totally possible for me to not have as many numbers as I might want, and that is okay. I can work on doing things differently and making sure that I do have better numbers coming in. Excuse me. But yeah, anyway, I'm really thankful. What I was trying to get at was that I'm really thankful, even though I don't have great numbers, which again, it's not the end of the world. There's things that I could still do to do better, but it doesn't necessarily affect how I still look at how far I've come so far. I'm really thankful for the fact that 100 odd people have subscribed to the channel and 100 odd people have started following me on Twitter and Instagram since, or Instagram as in like the channel page. I'm really thankful for all of that, and this wouldn't be possible without you guys, because sometimes it can be hard to put yourself out there into the void, but then it's nice to see that there's something that people find from this. So yeah, I'm really thankful to you for that, for being a part of this journey and for supporting me in all the ways that you have. So thank you so much, and stay tuned for what's to come in the future. But until then, don't forget to keep your mind open to different perspectives, because you never know, random relatability might just be around the corner.